Hello. Today we're talking about making races truly weird. You've all probably been in this situation where you're making a new character for whatever system, whether it be a, typical fantasy system like Dungeons and Dragons, you're making a new character, you're about to pick a race, and really, other than for looks and flavor, the choice is unclear, and it might all seem the same. Some of you might be really keen to optimize your character build, therefore, you'll always pick the race that is the most advantageous to your game plan. However, you don't pick it because of its history, of its culture, right? Maybe you might pick an orc because you want to fight and be in the melee, or you might pick an elf because you want to be a wizard and the racial traits synergize with your class or your abilities. Now, as game masters and designers, what would it look like for us to offer players truly unique, truly weird races for them to pick? Now, we all know the traditional races. So we have humans, well, kind of, but for the purposes of this video, we'll just assume that Aragorn is a regular human, even if he's not. So human, dwarf, and elf. And if you really get into the nitty-gritty details, at least in systems like Dungeons and Dragons, 5e, or Pathfinder, they're more or less the same. You can pretty much do everything that any of the other races could do. Right? If you're a dwarf, you can pretty much do everything that a human can do, and if you're an elf, you can do everything that the other two can do. It's mostly interchangeable. So, what kind of offerings do we have? Well, if you know here from Pathfinder, we have the plant people, and I believe they're called Leshith. You'd think, wow, they're so different from the humanoid races. And yet, if you look at it mechanically, they more or less just do the same thing. So, how much does being a plant person change your experience playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Well, probably not. Unless your game master really hones into making that a relevant part of the campaign, it probably won't impact much. And if for some reason you might be able to, record a session or a few, would listeners really be able to always tell that you are playing a plant person? Maybe not, right? Since in combat, you use the same spells, you wield the same weapons, you do the same things in social encounters, it's more or less the same. Again, unless your game master really does a lot of heavy lifting on that front and makes everything different, where every single NPC has a bespoke reaction to you being a plant person, right? It goes for the same. Sometimes I have players asking me questions like, oh, can I play an undead? Can I play this? Can I play that? Well, I tell them if I have to run this campaign the way the cultures, the people in those cultures would truly react, if you'd be an undead or some kind of dark elf or whatnot, nobody will want to talk to you. So is that really the experience you want playing in this campaign, right? If we play things to how they would naturally unfold, what most people look for in their RPG experience is actually just playing a human where everybody reacts to you normally. You can do all the things, which is like extra favor. So you just want to be human with pointy ears. You just want to be a human with a long beard and a little bit shorter. You just want to be a human that looks like a plant, but you still want to be a human. Right? Who actually wants to play something that is truly monstrous, truly different? So the next point goes into what can we learn from other TTRPGs and other genres of TTRPGs, right? Arguably, in Vampire, you're playing at what looks like the most like a human, but what still is very far from humanity. You're playing someone truly monstrous, and a lot of fun in the game is kind of this um, tug of war between monstrosity and humanity. And one of the things that you get to do in Vampire is feed. It's a cool part of the experience. But it's interesting to see how running vampire you would handle feeding versus things in, let's say, D&D or Pathfinder. One of the things you do all the time in Dungeons and Dragons and similar games is rest. But most game masters will simply skip over it. So, oh, well, you done it. It's 8 hours later now. You did the thing. And when you have a class like an elf who doesn't get to sleep but has a trance instead, it's like a cool part of the racial abilities, and your game master just skips over resting, well, then you might as well just play a human because there's no difference. Going back to our example of vampire, imagine if you have all these different clans of vampires and each individual vampire has their own feeding restrictions and preferences, but your game master, your storyteller, just hand waves everything. Say, oh, you want to feed? Well, you just feed. So, how does your feeding restriction, something that is core to your character, come into play then if everything is being hand waved? So, hand waving feeding is like skipping through long rests, right? So, we want to think about what kind of these differentiating factors, how can we maintain them without getting into heavy bookkeeping and turning everything into a slog? Ultimately, the core principle of our design, we want to get into asymmetrical design. Right? We can take inspiration from a lot of other games and video games where, for example, we see in StarCraft, we have 3 different races and they're all different. They more or less do the same thing in the same that they collect resources and have bases. So there is a lot of similarity. You're still playing the same game, but other than the workers, each race has completely different set of units and plays differently. And yet they're balanced against each other. So we want to have a situation where our 3 typical fantasy races are completely different, yet still balanced. And you can be balanced in different ways. So, what kind of avenues do we have? Well, if we look at other examples of asymmetrical design, we have, for example, in Dota 2, Meepo, who can be 3 characters, but it's still balanced to function in the game. So even there's 3 times as many of you, you're still functioning properly. So for example, you could imagine a race if you're designing, right? Races for D&D, you could imagine a race like an elf, but you could also imagine a race like 3 goblins in a trench coat. So now you're playing 3 goblins or 3 kobolds in a trench coat. There's 3 times as many of you, or maybe some kind of hive mind creature, right? Maybe like 3 mushroom people, but they are all like connected. Their nervous systems are all connected. It's kind of a hive mind. So there's 3 times as many of you, but of course you'd be squishier. There would be certain balancing mechanisms in play. And perhaps for an elf, maybe you may be more powerful than a human, but just the costs and the effort in maintaining who you are as a person might be more expensive. There might be more challenges, more expenses, more effort expended in just being who you are as an adventurer versus a human, for example, just gets to eat and drink, and they can just carry on, but they might be less powerful than an elf, which is what you see in fiction, for example. In Lord of the Rings, the elven soldiers are portrayed as more capable, but at the same time, every time an elf dies, you realize, oh, that is a huge cost because it took probably centuries for them to become who they are. And it's not like you can find an elven child, in every street corner that you look. So they can be balanced in the grand scheme of things, but play out differently and have different strengths and weaknesses. If we go into the extreme, we can see, for example, designers such as publishers such as Rule for Combat, go completely crazy with this where you can play as a dungeon, right? So your character becomes a dungeon. Now, for those who've tried this out, I would love to hear in the comments, how different did that feel? When you were playing as the dungeon race, how different was your experience from just playing one of the regular races? Now, to close off the video, I want to show you what that could look like. So if we really think about this asymmetrical design and we take on one aspect, I mentioned long rest previously. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. If we wanted to shift the design into something more asymmetrical, more different, yet still balanced, we could see, uh, again, going back to our three typical fantasy races, humans, elves, and dwarves, what could it look like for them to long rest? Well, humans, you keep it simple, they sleep. So, what's the advantage? Well, when you sleep, you don't need to do anything. You just sleep, it just happens. However, while you're sleeping, obviously, you're unconscious. Not ideal, right? You're very vulnerable. You probably need other people to keep watch. You need people to protect you. If you ever do get attacked, you might need to, it might take a while for you to get onto your feet and be ready to fight or do anything. And it's quite an imperative where you need to regularly sleep unless otherwise you will accrue exhaustion. So it is balanced against effort. It's super easy, but it has a lot of drawbacks. Elves, on the other hand, if you want to really lean into the fact that they don't need to rest, well, they might not need to rest at all. So they can just keep going and might need to take breaks, obviously, but they don't need to rest. So what other thing would they need to do? Well, you could have a system where there is a trial of memories, for example. So since we are operating under the assumption that they're so radically different, a completely different race to humans, it's just their psyche functions differently. And if they get to live forever or a really long time, they get to become so old that they regularly need to perform this trial of memories where they literally go, journey down memory lane to try to find themselves, find who they are, reconnect with their past memories that are now spanning such a long period of time. Otherwise, they risk, the danger to lose themselves. If that were to happen, they would essentially become either they would become crazy or they would just cease to function in an intelligent kind of way. They might just be reduced to someone that's very comatose in a still healthy body. Going to our dwarves, what could it look like? Again, we want to make races even weirder. So if we have a dwarf, someone who's very into material culture, you could have a system maybe where they don't heal normally, right? So regularly they will need to take breaks and kind of perform these rituals. And depending on your system, depending on your game, you can flavor it differently, right? It could be that they need to, it could be magical rituals, right? Supernatural rituals, or it could be literally they have tools and med kits and they need to fix themselves up or drink potions. And while the humans sleep, the dwarves might just sit on a stool or on a bench and mend themselves most of the night. So again, they are awake and aware and might not need to rest or sleep like humans. So they can go for longer, but there's this long span of time where they're incapacitated. And of course, it is more resource intensive. You probably need to spend money on whatever components for your ritual, or whatever gear you need to mend your own flesh and keep your body healthy. So these could be avenues to explore further in design. Just wanted to give everyone an example of the train of thought that was being explored. Now, if you have your own ideas on how to make races truly weird, especially if it's expanding further on this, I'd love to hear in the comment, and I'll see you all in the next video.